repeated. To walk away now would not merely destroy NATO's credibility, more importantly, it would be a breach of faith with thousands of innocent civilians whose only desire is to live in peace and who took us at our word. Yeah. Madam Speaker, I say this to the British people. There is a heavy responsibility on a government when putting our armed forces into battle to justify such action. And I warn, the potential consequences of military action are serious, both for the NATO forces and for the people in the region. Their suffering cannot be ended overnight. But in my judgment, the consequences of not acting are more serious still for human life and for peace in the long term. We must act to save thousands of innocent men, women, and children from humanitarian catastrophe, from death, barbarism, and ethnic cleansing by a brutal dictatorship, and to save the stability of the Balkan region, where we know chaos can engulf the whole of the European Union.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show, where left is best as it is everywhere else. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA. Usually I do it in the other order, but being that as it may, we are with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Vic Viana, David Slavic, Artesia, everybody else holding it down in the ever-expanding, and Forrest, of course, ever-expanding TMBS universe. On this week's program, Daniel Bessner, professor of international relations and history at the University of Washington. We're talking about what would a post-empire foreign policy look like? What would it look like for broadening human rights? What would it look like in an age of extreme inequality and ecological crisis? Also, the harmful and pernicious legacy of Samantha Power, the branding of humanitarian intervention, U.S. empire, and Barack Obama's infamous smart war versus dumb war distinction. Two 90s babies trying to figure out a better way of doing things. Bessner returns. Then we have a shout out striking Amazon workers put the company on its back heels for at least several hours, one of the most dangerous monopolies on the planet. We have a gem with David Griscom. Dave, what are you talking about in the gem?
Talking about forced arbitration.
Forced arbitration. It doesn't get any more sexy than that, folks. And obviously, we're going to be having the backs of Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, AOC, and Ayanna Pressley against the sclerotic, pathetic, reactionary, failed and failing Democratic Party leadership, as well as the white supremacist who runs the country and his bigot party. He has a strategy here for a race war re-election. Democrats want to sit on the sidelines and hide, and there's a small amount who are fighting in the post-game. We have Bads, Sam Harris, Maureen Dowd. We have a ton of sound to get to, and I know that you will be sending us your clips of the incredible showdown right now that's happening between Dave Rubin and my second choice in the Democratic primary, Marianne Williamson. We all know that Dave, in addition to being cynical, dim, historically illiterate, is very spiritually unwell. So I am very excited about Marianne's exchange of ideas and energy. It's a jam-packed show. Vic Viana is going to be with us in a crew post-game. But first, let's talk about redefining and enlarging human rights for the 21st century. Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, has been, in many respects, not entirely the face. Donald Trump is obviously the prime face of barbarism and grotesqueness in our world. But Mike Pompeo, as Secretary of State, has been a main agent of a global acceleration of a disregard for human life and human rights. He's the administration's main point person on backing the genocidal Saudi war on Yemen, which has claimed so many lives and engaged in endless atrocities. He's been a coup and warmonger in Venezuela and Iran and countless other areas where this administration has, and let's of course be real and realistic, accelerated and extended U.S. imperial policy and disregard for human rights. And it was just announced in the past couple of weeks that Mike Pompeo will have a new office that will form a human rights advisory council on so-called inalienable rights. This is what Pompeo said announcing the council. Fresh thinking about human rights discourse, where such discourse has departed from our nation's founding principles of natural law and natural rights. And if that sets off your focus that this commission is going to be all about an assault globally on the LGBTQ community and an assault on women's autonomy in terms of their own health care, of course, you're absolutely right. Leading the panel is Marianne Glendon. She's a Harvard professor known for her extreme reactionary views on marriage equality, on abortion. There's a broad religious makeup of the panel, and its intentions are clear. Now, Samuel Moyn, who wrote one of the most interesting books of our time, Rights Are Not Enough, has written that actually this council in some ways is an important distillation to track because it's a next step in a formalization of the alliance between the sort of hard right nationalist stance and the religious conservatives as crystallized in this specific argument to narrow human rights. And he and other leftists like Heidi Matthews actually are quite aware that there is a lot of problems and challenges inside traditional human rights frameworks and narratives. We're going to be talking with Daniel Bessner about the horrific legacy of humanitarian intervention, which started from some very noble places, namely wanting to stop atrocities across the world, including in Bosnia and the trauma of the Rwandan genocide. However, our so-called humanitarian interventions, of course, have led to accelerated crises, civilian deaths, and abuses in places like Libya, among many examples. What we need to do, as with so many other challenges and crises of the Trump era, is one, first and foremost, of course, fight against and defend the rights of LGBTQ people and women that are going to be in the center strike of this panel. But more broadly, we can't go back to a discourse of human rights that, as Moyn has documented, has in an extremely disastrous end, has led towards the sort of rhetoric of humanitarian intervention. And also in a more, also a less dramatic, but also profoundly problematic way, led to a sort of amnesty internationalization, where no question there's important work documenting abuses across the globe, but those abuses are so narrowly defined that they do not encompass a broader understanding of justice and politics. That's as an example among many reasons why Amnesty International has not spoken out on the case of Lula da Silva, or even, in fact, and specifically being very specific, on the actual charges that Julian Assange is facing in the United States. These are serious threats. And more broadly, these groups have not had a discourse on social rights, on labor rights, on the broader material realities of human flourishing. That's a Marxist understanding. It also could be a social democratic understanding of actually enlarging what we mean here. Marxists understood that human rights are nothing but principles on their own. The principle on their did little to protect Eugene Debs, as an example, when he spoke out against World War I. All men were created equal was empty, of course, because of slavery. the second-class citizenship of women and the genocide of Native Americans. And, of course, the use of so-called human rights to justify interference and imperial adventuring from Venezuela to Iraq to Afghanistan. Human rights need to be structured in a materialist whole that recognizes power asymmetries and broad material needs. The human rights movement has failed to include economic inequality. In large part, it's due because they're afraid of angering wealthy donors, challenging capitalist power structures. We do not need to condemn or abandon human rights. Of course not. We just need to enlarge it. As Samuel Moyn argues, the human rights movements should stick to what it does best, informing our concepts of citizenship and stigmatizing evil, without purporting to stand for the whole of global justice. The whole of global justice is going to deal with what the IMF and the World Bank do to developing countries. It's going to deal with the civilian casualties of imperial actors wherever they act. And it's going to deal with the mass deprivation of people from things, whether it be healthcare, education, or indeed something like the privatization of water that we were discussing last week. While recognizing its limits, human rights creates a baseline to argue for and debate in the legal system, and can we use to highlight contradictions and abuses by the state. This is why the Trump administration is trying to destroy these principles, and why we must loudly oppose them and make the next wave of arguments for an enlarged, materially grounded rights of the 21st century. That's what so many of these arguments go back to. The liberal mindset, the resistance mindset, wants to go back to an order that is dead, an order that has allowed the rise of these monsters that we see, like the Donald Trumps and Mike Pompeos. We need to fight them, protect our allies, protect all human beings, and enlarge and have a real global justice that's fit to purpose for the 21st century. Do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, I think something that's really important to make clear when we're talking about human rights is that, it's not something that you can just proclaim and there'll be correct action on it. You do need social power and social movements to enact these things. So when we're talking about the American context too, just like liberal rights and all the failures from our Constitution and how it was actually implemented across the country throughout our history, this idea of protecting the minority from the tyranny of the majority wasn't really something that was put into practice, right? But what was put into practice was large social movements, in large part inspired by and using the rhetoric of human rights and liberal rights and saying we need to put this into action and into practice. That really makes a massive difference, which is why what the Trump administration is trying to do by pulling away rights for women and pulling away rights for the LGBTQ community, etc., is really dangerous, because if they're able to do this, just symbolically, it only opens up the door for actual material abuses.
Right.
I think we might have some programming to consult here. 1 second.
The system that drove us into this ditch are the only people qualified to lead us out of this ditch. Slavery didn't end because the political establishment woke up one day and said, let's end slavery. The abolitionist movement actually began with the early evangelicals and the early Quakers. The people stepped in, and that's what began the path to abolition. Same with giving women the right to vote. The political establishment didn't wake up one day and say, let's give women the right to vote. With the women's suffrage movement, it was an example of the people stepping in, which then led the political establishment to make changes.
So in a weird way, does it seem like we're sort of absurdly focused on politics all the time instead of actually what you're talking about, which is more a movement of the people that it's not necessarily political per se.
Well, I think that's sort of the point. Abolition was a moral stance. Women's suffrage was a moral stance.
Okay, that is amazing. That is amazing. And it does actually fit with the commentary. So Dave, in response, and whatever else you say about Marianne Williamson, that's more history than I've ever seen on that show.
Yeah, mentioning
that's more history and
abolitionists,
sociology than I've ever seen on that show. Ever. And so Dave takes that as an opportunity to be like, because what John Brown and abolitionists were like was they really were a bunch of people who were just like, we should just end slavery with ideas. Lincoln was like, I don't want to fight a civil war. People are too wrapped up in politics.
I think Dave
is so fucking stupid, dude. It's relentless.
Harriet Beecher Stowe wasn't perfect, but I think Dave would definitely consider her SJW.
Yeah, no, that's true. Harriet Beecher Stowe is always just. Don't you think Harriet Beecher Stowe is part of this like
it's too much
SJW
emotion.
left?
She uses too many appeals to emotion.
So then you have a case like Harriet Beecher Stowe. Or no, that would actually that would be the Sam Harris, right? It's like, I mean, then you have Harriet Beecher Stowe, and of course I condemn the Ku Klux Klan, but she's the moral equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan. Man, if all of these people were on Twitter at the time, all of their feeds would literally just be slavery should end, but like Lincoln is divisive. Harriet Beecher Stowe is an SJW. Is Frederick Douglass secretly a Mohammedan? that would be the whole fucking feed. I mean, there's a lot of, I understand that Frederick Douglass making a lot of the right noises, but I have a lot of concern about what it actually means when the Negro actually is in the main house. And I shouldn't be condemned for saying that. Civil War era Sam Harris.
Oh, man.
Right.
There's
More than half
definitely a guy that is just that literally existed back then that was doing just that.
Totally. And that's what they're doing.
My racial paranoia is perfectly justifiable along rational lines.
No. You're not understanding. They put the brain. They had people from Africa that they put in a zoo and they observed them for science. You can't argue with facts.
I get that slavery is bad, but on one hand, we have an escaped slave that cut the throat of a young farmer girl. And what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so in other words, we need to take this seriously, okay? Nat Turner hurt a lot of people that were offering to give him water. Okay, so in other words, I agree with you. Slavery is wrong. But if we don't deal with the fact that Nat Turner led an uprising, then we're not being morally serious.
Do you want another Haiti here?
That is amazing, though. It's like, so it's like, yeah, because the suffragettes, they all went down the street and they were smoking cigarettes. And that was kind of cool, right?
So what you're saying
I saw that picture.
Is the suffragettes prove that everyone's just too consumed in politics these days.
Yeah, good takeaway.
It's like, no, so Marianne Williamson, her whole point about the abolitionist movement was that people are too wrapped up in identity politics.
That was just 5 minutes in, too. So.
Oh my God. He's so fucking stupid. And what's amazing and what's interesting there, that's the funny thing to me, honestly, about Marianne Williamson is that she like, everybody does their jokes about the orbs and whatever. I don't care either way, but she is, she's a best-selling author. Like, she's incredibly media trained. So I think she's very well aware of the kind of platform she's going on. And she's aware that, Dave is, it's not that hard to pick up that Dave might have some limitations.
Do you want to sample Dave's questioning technique?
Yes, please. I'd like a little bit more. Thank you. This is a great detour.
And was to say, in about 35 some odd years, you're going to be on stage running for president of the United States. And at the first debate, you're kind of going to be the one that most people are talking about. What would you have said?
If that's God's will, then that's God's will.
Huh. Fuck yeah.
All right. So let's dive into a couple things here.
Now, am I being too sympathetic to Marianne Williamson, where I kind of felt like that was her way of saying, like, let's get to it, asshole? People have been tweeting me clips of you with Stefan Molyneux all day. I'm not playing nice with you, you fucking prick. You
I think
fucking empty.
I think the calculations that just went through Dave's head were, well, in a past life, I would have challenged that because I'm an atheist skeptic. But I have been hanging out with Ben Shapiro, so I should probably let it pass.
I think he's also just so traumatized from what he did from the Joe Rogan building code experience that he's loath to challenge anybody. It's like, well, if I ask Marianne what she means by that, what if all of a sudden 2 minutes later I'm saying Amazon and blah, blah, blah?
Well, because he's finally got a Democrat to sit down with him after the Buttigieg thing fell through, after everyone scolded his social media guy for saying, like, we'll talk.
Bad form, Buttigieg
I gotta be really
form,
nice. I'm on my best behavior with Marianne.
Right. Okay, Marianne Williamson's here. We don't quote. We don't. All right. No questions about phrenology.
Not going to talk about social cohesion.
Not going to talk about social cohesion. It's serious Dave time. Because I'm open-minded, and you know what's great about this? And again, no shade on Marianne Williamson, but we're gonna hear about this for like the next year. It's like, yeah, I know that I had the head and I didn't even know, but you tell me he was a part of a meth lab. Like, Dave Rubin is going to interview, like, the fucking head of the biker gang from Breaking Bad, who tells him that his, like, speech was suppressed at, like, a coffee shop in Albuquerque. And then people go like, hey, Dave, why did you have, like, the white supremacist head of a meth ring? Well, I didn't exactly know, but ideas, and I had on Marianne Williamson 6 months ago. That's going to be his stand-in. You know that, right? A lot is. You got a clip?
No, I'm
drop?
just listen through more of it.
I can't wait to hear more of this. I'm so excited. All right, we have a new shout-out song. So we're going to get to the shout-out, but don't worry, we will certainly be listening to more of this. Ready for the shout-out? Yes, I'm ready for the shout-out.
I'm looking for a remix. And now the shout-out. Valuable shout-out.
The pile of ideas returned to low. It's quickly moving into the hot position.
And now the shout-out. Beta male.
Recovery mode.
Shout-out.
My brain is
geopolitical politics.
Shout-out.
Competition would start kicking in.
Shout-out.
I'm not funded by the Koch brothers.
Shout-out.
Amazing.
Shout-out.
Good job, Ed. Workers in Minnesota are striking at an Amazon plant. The week before, I'm quoting now from a piece in, where is this from?
The Verge.
The Verge. A week before, Shakopee workers had announced their intentions to strike on the first day of Amazon Prime Day this year, which lasts 2 days. So everybody, guys, in general, I'm not necessarily, as of now at least, during these 2 days, don't use Amazon. Don't be a scam. Don't be a scab. Be in solidarity with striking workers. It would be the first work stoppage at a facility during the peak shopping time, the most ambitious in an escalating series of actions at the Shakopee Fulfillment Center. Shortly before 2 p.m., when the day shift workers planned to walk out, Hibak Mohammed and several other workers came to the lobby. 26 years old, Mohammed is originally from Somalia but immigrated to Kenya, then won a visa lottery to come to the U.S. 3 years ago. His first job in the country was at Amazon. At first, she liked it, but the pace of the work had increased to grueling levels, and more workers were getting fired for not keeping up. I'm new in the country, and I know we have rights, she told me on the phone earlier. That's what America does. It makes things better. And if something isn't right and not fair, I decided to become a strong person that I have a right to speak up. We know that Amazon underpays workers significantly. Yes, Bernie Sanders pressured them into an increase in wages, which is still a pittance relative to their profitability in business. We know that they structure a lot of their employment arrangements, as do other Silicon Valley companies, to keep people just outside of full-time work so they're not eligible for benefits. We know that frictionless supply chains are a structural threat to the environment and labor. And part of what we're going to need to do is a few things are just going to need to be a little bit slower, frankly, so that there's less of a relentless demand on human and ecological resources. These strikes, which are escalating in the United States, also in Europe, are some of the most inspiring and important things happening on the planet today, and the exact inverse of a politics that at its worst puts its blind faith in the hateful, grotesque, fake, lie, charlatan populism of Donald Trump, and a shallow resistance fantasy that considers Jeff Bezos to be some type of salvation figure, some type of hero, when in fact he is one of the prime drivers of the most brutal, unsustainable, relentless, feudalistic capitalist economics on the planet today. The way to defeat this is through policy, through breaking up monopolies, through nationalization, through banning certain practices. And the core engine is the incredible courage, like this 26-year-old Somali woman having the courage to go on strike. The company is implementing, they've been sending company representatives from Amazon or outside of the facility taking names, trying to intimidate and terrorize people. While they do that, they've sent out a national press release saying, well, everybody should be fighting for a higher minimum wage so they can continue to have, I mean, and God knows who's still buying this, whatever sort of fake brand they have as a positive corporate citizen. Of course, they're not. They're a structural danger to labor and the environment, and we have all solidarity with striking workers. Don't use Amazon the next couple of days. And you know what? As these things escalate, maybe we're going to have to significantly increase our solidarity Amazon strike time as well. So shout out.
It's also cool to me to note that this was a team up between the local SEIU union and CARE, which is regularly demonized by people like Glenn Beck, basically incites violence against them.
Right.
So just shout out to them for doing good work.
That's awesome. That is the future. Do we have any more of this?
There's a big section where they talk about racism and...
oh, we got to hear this.
Okay, yeah. Let's see where it's...
Because Marianne Williamson, I think, has actually been pretty clear about American racism. And we all know Dave Rubin. Ooh, maybe I should change the titles of more of my Mal on You videos after this. All right, let's watch this.
Okay, so and I want to dive into some of the economic parts of that in a little bit, but you said something, when I knew I wanted to have you on the show, was during the debate, you said something that I thought this is actually completely unheard of for a Democrat, at least in 2019, to say. You said, I do not believe that the average American is racist.
No, I don't.
And yet, it seems, if you watch mainstream media, we are just caught in you're racist, you're a bigot, you're a fascist, you're a homophobe, you're a transphobe, this endless game. And unfortunately, and I say this as someone that was, that I still consider myself liberal, but I'm a lifetime Democrat, really, at least until the last 2 or so years. A lot of that's coming out of the left and from the Democrats, this labeling of everyone as racist.
Well, I hear you, and you're leaving out a very important factor, which is that the president, at least based on his tweets and his comments, is. So I agree with you that a smug, self-righteous, intolerant left-winger is no less dangerous to the emotional fabric of our country than a smug, self-righteous, intolerant right-winger. And some of the shutdown, you shut up, you didn't say the right thing, comes from the left as much as the right these days. I will give you that. And it's dangerous and it's wrong. However, this president says things and is involved in it right now, which by any measure are racist comments.
Oh, no.
Where else were you
Pause
going
it.
with that? I can't
Well,
This
do you
is
find it
actually
sort of almost
amazing.
impossible to have any kind of
No, this is actually really significant. I don't even want to get into the debate of I think the notion of the average person being quote unquote racist, I'm actually going to fall on the Marianne Williamson side in the sense that I think for practical intents and purposes, her frame is right.
I also don't think racism is a winning strategy broadly with the actual Democratic
No, that's
public.
the point I'm making. Right, exactly. So look, if we really interrogate it and we read Kendi's book or The Mismeasure of Man, obviously, look, this is a historically and structurally racist society. So obviously racism lives in each and every one of us. That is the insight and the correct stance of the so-called SJW position or whatever. Now, conversely, I think where she is right, and I think totally if you're talking to people who are voting in a Democratic primary, there's plenty of people who might not use all the right terminology. They might even have genuine disagreements. They might even have some attitudes that you and I would genuinely find off-putting. But when it comes to the real foundational material stuff of like, are you on board for this material delivery and serious legislation on voting rights, civil rights, and the serious questions of economic redistribution, yeah, they absolutely can be on board for that. And that's where you focus on them. And that is where, again, all of the vampire castle scolding performativity is vanishingly, it is interesting to a fraction of the population. And mostly, by the way, a highly overrepresented, overeducated social media population. This is like not normal discourse for Americans across the board who are not in these spaces. So I think she's right overall in her frame. I have a little bit of a problem with her. I'll make this argument. If I'm on Dave's show, I'm only on pure offense because Dave is a bad actor. On the other hand, he has nowhere to go because she's completely disarmed all he has is that shtick. Because in my opinion, 100% he is a racist, in my opinion, and 100% a conduit for all of these things, knowingly or unknowingly. He could be unknowingly because he's clearly, to me, an extremely dim guy. But he's got nowhere else to go now. So we'll see where he goes.
And then where else were you going with that? I can't
well,
remember.
do you find it sort of almost impossible to have any kind of political conversation that doesn't get whittled down to this? Because that sort of seems like where we're at. I don't even really know who's talking about policy anymore, or really what I would rather talk about all day long, which is how much.
Minor point. You've trapped a Democratic candidate in your little studio. Talk policy, Dave.
Yeah, I don't know, Dave. Dave, this is a great
about.
Opportunity. I mean, I'm sure you've got some really serious questions about how to implement Medicare for all.
I hate talking about how censorious the left is every single episode of my show.
Yeah, I mean,
love the opportunity.
It's so boring to talk about how moralistic the left and SJWs. I mean, there's literally one or two other things I'd like to vaguely talk about.
Much government is needed to do anything. See anymore, or really what I would rather talk about all day long, which is how much government is needed to do anything, which I think would be a rich place to have a discussion.
I think it's more complicated than that. I think we need to walk and chew gum at the same time. On the one hand, I certainly understand what you mean about how the public square is a place where it's almost impossible to have a conversation these days. Although you just need to not be on Twitter too much. There are places that just make that worse. That's not the place for intelligent political conversation.
Yeah.
However, I'm a Jew. And I remember the first time I went to Yad Vashem. Have you ever been to?
I have been, yeah, in Jerusalem.
Then having been there, Hitler was saying things for years. He was saying what he believed, and he said what he was going to do. The world didn't take him seriously. And so much in books.
People like Dave Rubin would not take them seriously. Exactly. Thank you. I am literally speaking to you a moral, empty-headed moron. Go ahead.
The world didn't take him seriously. And so much, and books have been written, so many books have been written in years of analysis. Why didn't people leave? Why didn't take it seriously? And the answer was clearly, because everybody thought he was a crazy guy. Nobody took it seriously. Nobody thought it could actually lead anywhere. But then once he started actually doing what he did, and you looked back, and you see those films at Yad Vashem, he was saying it. And I'm sorry, we are naive to underestimate the danger of that kind of hate speech when it is coming from the highest perches of government.
So do you fundamentally believe that Trump has that in him? That
I'm not here to I don't need to psychoanalyze the president. What I'm speaking to is the effect on government and the country. The words of the president. And the words of the president are very serious. And the words of the president affect not only people in this country, but they affect other countries too. Everybody's listening to the words of the American president. And yes, I think it's time for Americans to awaken to the lessons of history.
College campuses.
Yeah,
Yes, I do. This
there
is
was a
very,
mean
very serious.
college Twitter
Now,
account.
when you said what we also need to be thinking about, I do too, including the fact that, now we're going through this business. Well, the president said this about these congresswomen, and now these congresswomen, and what is the Democratic Party going to say about these congresswomen? Where I do think this is enough has to do with the fact that the deeper levels of systemic racism, and there is systemic racism in this country,
Here we
ways
go.
in which social policy,
Pause it.
economic policy.
I'm sorry. A lot of points now that we're getting to, because this, of course, is the real issue. And to me, right, I think she's exactly right about how to approach people as individuals and with persuasion and the censoriousness and everything. But look, that's just not a campaign strategy, right? But this is the area, and the fact that people like Dave Rubin will always deny systemic and institutional racism, and of course that overlaps with our history, with
Rubin
class
literally-
structure. That's his whole reason for existing. That's the whole reason you're, that's the whole show.
He literally went to Oxford. That's what he talked about at Oxford.
Right. He's going to have nothing on this. Let's actually this is props to her. Let's play more of this.
Has to do with the fact that the deeper levels of systemic racism, and there is systemic racism in this country, ways in which social policy, economic policy, criminal policy is tinged by obvious racial prejudice. There is no doubt about that.
So can you give me an example of that?
Yes. You could take white people and black people use drugs at the same rate, but a black person is liable to get a far harsher sentence for the same drug offense. So there is racial disparity throughout.
Wait, I'm a libertarian, so I can't
criminal
argue with
sentencing.
that.
Another example is there are millions of American children who go to school every day in schools that don't even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, then the chances of high school graduation are drastically diminished, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased.
Oh, but I heard about brain
These children
sizes.
live, many of them in what's called America's domestic war zones, where psychologists say the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq is no more severe than the PTSD of these children. Now, these children, this is how it works in America. We primarily base our educational funding on property taxes. And since there's higher poverty among black
Pause
children...
it. You guys ready to give her some props?
I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah.
We ready to give her some props?
I'll take this opportunity to say I was wrong, Marianne. Good job.
Good, doing good. All right, let's watch a little bit more.
taxes. And since there's higher poverty among black children, that means that if you are a child growing up in a nice neighborhood in America, you have a very good chance of a high quality public school education. But public school education should not be better for the rich than for the poor.
What?
So because most of these poverty-ridden neighborhoods are neighborhoods inhabited by people of color. Not that poverty is only people of color. Even though among people of color you have a higher rate of poverty, poverty itself is a huge and almost ubiquitous reality in America among white people too.
Second
So
choice
when you
Democrat.
see things like this, for instance, as president, I wish to see this change. I wish to see every school in America a palace of learning, culture, and the arts. There has been described, there's a term that was first coined by Marianne Wright Edelman, cradle to prison pipeline. And when you look at the sentencing of black
Pause
people
it.
and people of color.
I love the fact that, first of all, okay, Dave's dumb, Dave's agreeable, and he's also, to me, it looks like he's getting anxiety because his audience is going to have a fucking meltdown.
I need to look through the comments.
Yeah,
actually.
it's like,
absolutely.
she's lying. Look up, and then what's great is I have no doubt the comment. I mean, look, maybe there'll be some. Oh, it's so nice that you finally had a human being on your show instead of like all of these troglodytes you usually host. But I think that the responses will be overwhelmingly, absolutely disgusting and racist. But go ahead, let's play 1 minute more, then we'll move on. We'll do more of this in the post game, though.
in our prison system. Absolutely, to deny that there's not a terrible racial injustice going on underneath there is just to willfully deny the facts.
So there's this video of
He doesn't address it. He talks about this video that
of what?
It was. Well, we can let him explain, I guess.
Let's just see this for a second.
although I think it's from January, where you were giving a speech and you had the white people in the audience basically go up to the black people in the crowd, and they kind of put their hand on them, and then you read.
Brett Weinstein would like set the place on fire before doing that.
Brett Weinstein, I'm not apologizing to any black people. I did nothing wrong, and I'm going to go on Joe Rogan, and then I'm going to talk to Peter Thiel, and it's very scary. And you know, in the 1990s, I was a big fan of Patrick Ewing, and the idea that I have to apologize, even though I rooted for the '94 Knicks, is very scary to me. And if we're being right about this, the science, black people commit all the crime, but I can't say that anymore. I just gave you the leading light of the intellectual dark web right there. Go ahead.
It almost was like a sermon, really. It was your speech, and you talked about white supremacy, and you talked about reparations, and all of these things. So for me watching it, as someone that I despise identity politics, I think it is what has, it's the root of almost everything that is wrong right now.
For me watching it as a one-trick pony with no sense of history or empathy, I found it somewhat confusing and upsetting, but I also didn't know that you were going to be talking about Marianne Wright Edelman and actual policy, so I really appreciate that video exists to give me a comfortable pivot point to talk about something that doesn't require me to do any actual analysis.
I think it is what has, it's the root of almost everything that is wrong right now, which is why I'm struggling so much with what I would say is my former team, let's say. There was a certain collective guilt to what you were saying that was really troubling to me. I was really struggling when I was watching it.
Okay. So
not that your intentions were not good, you know what I mean? But that the idea of these sort of guilt-ridden white people, many of whom probably, well, certainly none of them in that room owned slaves, and probably many of them never came from descendants of slaves, nor would I think that you're guilty for your father's sins, much less your great-grandfather's sins, etc. There was a certain collective guilt to it that struck me as scary. Does that ring with you?
No, not at all, but I'll tell you why.
Great.
There's a difference between taking blame and taking responsibility.
Yes!
The German nation has paid $89 billion.
I'm sorry. That is actually I'm sorry. You can tell me that I'm like, you know, Deepak communist here, but that is actually a beautiful distinction. Nobody's talking about that. In fact, to the extent that character exists of some performative, woke, guilt-ridden person who's always I think it's pretty clear how much disdain that I have for that, and how totally disconnected that is from either a material analysis for politics or being like a proper, you know, normal human being responding to the grotesque history of this country. Blame versus and reality presently of this country, and your responsibility in that, because of course that's the other thing, is that it's all present tense, which Dave has no understanding of. But that is so beautiful. It's not moralization. It's not blame. It's not making a big show. It is responsibility. And I'll tell you what, I watched that video. I thought that video, and it's funny because I'm not into this sort of, I think most of that stuff is often a substitute for building solidarity in politics. I like Adolph Reed's critique of a lot of that. I thought that ceremony actually, to me, the way she did it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it's not like to take responsibility for actually owning slaves. It's to take responsibility for a system you're actively benefiting from and not just trying to obscure that fact.
We are inheritors of a context that was designed to benefit us and was built on the rape, pillage, and murder of other people. And it wasn't just slavery, you fucking moron. It's gentrification, it's policing, and on the other direction, it's colonialism and imperialism. And it's not like, ooh, I feel so bad, because that, and frankly, and look, it's not the same thing, but that's reducing it to the same level of moral cause politics. It's not. It's exactly, it's recognizing that we are, to quote Hillary Clinton, living history, and we need to take responsibility for that history in the present tense.
And it worries Dave Rubin so much because he then has to put things in context, and his entire worldview is about taking things out of context.
I want to go get a smoothie. I don't want to do this.
I want a smoothie. I don't want context to exist. Dave Rubin, by the way, and this is great. Though. Dave Rubin can walk around and be the blameless dope he is all day, but he does have to take responsibility. All right, let's play one more minute of this. I'm actually really liking this.
This is great.
Dollars to Jewish organizations since World War II. And by
Right.
the time they started paying those reparations, it was the generation after the war.
That's right.
Many of the people who started paying those reparations were children during that war. Nobody was saying...
But it was to the people who survived, not to generations after.
Absolutely. It was to Jewish organizations. Absolutely. Absolutely, it wasn't just to the people who survived. And let's talk about how few survived, okay?
Yeah.
So, no, it was not. It was to future generations. This is the issue. It is a spiritual concept.
They wrote
in
personal checks.
Catholics go to confession. And in Judaism, there is the concept of Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, you have to take a fearless moral inventory and admit the exact nature of your character
I'm down.
defects. Whether
Pause
it's an
it. I'm
individual
sorry.
or
That's also the power, and that's why it needs to be material reparations, but that's also why it needs to be Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's exactly it. It's an atonement. It's a full accounting of the present reality and the history. This is amazing. She's articulating it really well. And Dave is the perfect moral and intellectual void to symbolize, if we're going to talk in these terms, whiteness.
She's apathetically steamrolling him.
She is apathetically steamrolling him. Yes.
or a nation. You can't have the future you want unless you're willing to clean up the past. Now, nobody is saying, I mean, my grandparents came from Russia, in 2 generations ago. I don't believe that, I personally, I didn't own slaves. That's not what we're talking about when you're talking about national atonement and national amends. For instance, I want to tell you something else that I think a lot of Americans don't realize. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, and everybody who had been a surviving prisoner of the Japanese internment camps in World War II were given between $20,000 and $22,000. Now, this is the deal. A lot of Americans...
But that was the direct people that were affected.
That was. But let's talk about this. The first slaves were brought over from Africa, enslaved people, 1619. Slavery was not abolished until 1865, so that's 250 years. That was followed by another 100 years of institutionalized violence against black people in America. Lynchings, segregation, Ku Klux Klan. This is domestic terror. Black code laws which ensured subpar economic and social and political opportunities. When slavery was abolished in this country, the U.S. government promised, because there were 4 to 5 million slaves at that time, the U.S. government promised that every former enslaved person, family of 4, would receive 40 acres and a mule. That would have given people who
all right, we gotta
go.
What I just loved is just Jesus.
No, that's amazing.
Look at this dope taking it on. And it's so perfect because she is treating him like a kind of like dense but eager pupil. Oh, that's great. I mean, little did Dave realize that. I mean, look, it's not going to be the same dunk fest as if I or, Sam or Benjamin Dixon or, Anna Kasparian. Well, particularly Anna Kasparian. But, this is a dunk. I don't think he was expecting, oh, look, I have Marianne Williamson, and then I can pretend that I'm open-minded. I don't think he was expecting. And this is also a reason genuinely why I frankly oppose underestimating her. I think she's bringing something very valid to the table here.
I think it's also just funny to note that Dave's got this weird thing where he might be lucky that Buttigieg didn't join his show because he's not really up to scruff when it comes to this stuff. Like the questions he's asking aren't actually that. He thinks that they're tough because he hears like his echo chamber like dunk on like AOC with him all the time, but actually these are things that these politicians will have heard before.
Right. No, he's been out. No, absolutely. I mean, he's been playing like in the kiddie pool and he thinks that this is like powerful, persuasive stuff. That is actually really funny because as much as I really don't like Buttigieg. I think, and it wouldn't have been worth doing because it's just not important enough. But Buttigieg did a good job actually of putting Fox News on the spot. Right. If he went on Rubin, and again, there's no reason you go on Rubin. Rubin just isn't important enough to do it. But you could have had the same scenario where Buttigieg could have been like, hey, I never heard of you. And we still decided to not cancel and, because we want to speak to everybody, but we did a little bit of research on you and like, you're a racist idiot. I'm a Rhodes Scholar. That actually, thank God Buttigieg didn't do it because I would have had to give him props for a couple of weeks.
Actually, I think Buttigieg would have agreed a lot about like college kids and stuff.
No, Buttigieg used the phrase SJW in his memoir unironically. Observed anti-Iraq invasion protesters and homeless people with I won't say anthropological distance. I'll just say distance because he wasn't curious. All right. Obviously, programming is a little bit different. We're going to get to the gem, but we do need to. We're going to take a brief break, and we're going to talk with Daniel Bessner. Then we're going to do the gem. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Trump and the squad because we need to, and then we'll get to the post game. But we're going to take a minute break. Be right back with Daniel Bessner.
Thanks for the good fight, Dave. Much respect. I appreciate it. Look at you nice people being good on Super Chat. Every now and again I glance, we post the live stream. This tells you a little bit about the ecosystem of YouTube. But we post the live stream on YouTube. And I'll glance before we get on there about what's going on in the comment section. And I don't know what you people are doing. What do you people do? You're all fighting with each other, saying horrible things to each other. Often, the ones that amaze me the most, though, I really mean this, and I just glanced for literally 30 seconds. And it's like, there's all these people that seemingly don't like me in this comment section. And I don't care if you don't like me, I actually don't. But what I would say to you is, what are you doing with your life? Get off this channel. What are you doing? If you don't like me, go find something to do. There's plenty of other things you could be doing right now. You could take a run, you could play some video games, you could watch porn. There's many other, you could write. I don't know, what do? You could make coffee. You could stare at a fish tank. There's a zillion things you could do better than just endlessly sit there. Dave Rubin's wrong. What are you doing? Tell me what you're doing. If you're watching this right now, which I'm sure you are, what are you doing with your life? What can we do for you? I would recommend reading 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. That might help. Clean up your room, people.
While I still focus a lot on the left on all this stuff, it's because that's where all of the media is there, all of the academia is there, all of the mainstream everything is all being controlled by this horrific ideology that I truly believe could alter and destroy this country, all of the freedoms that we have. So it's like we've had a couple wins against them, and people are like, "No, you have to attack Trump." And it's like, wait a minute, we finally got a little win here in the war. And it's like, you don't just get a little pinprick and then run away and do something else. You got to keep going. So I'll keep calling it like I see it, but I'm just trying not to be hysterical.
By the way, I think another good way to fight it is to expose expose these people to the hysterical nutbags that they often are. Christina and I spoke at Portland State University, and Antifa, who they call themselves anti-fascists, but they're actually the fascists.
They're fascists.
They issued a statement before we spoke that said that we were anti-queer, I'm gay married, and that Christina is anti-woman. I mean, this is the height of absurdity. And this is why they're afraid to debate, and that's why we have to consistently push the debate to them. Because we'll do an hour of Q&A after this, and we're not going to, you say whatever you want. Anyone that's there can say whatever they want, and we'll gladly dissect it. And that's how you win with more. Yeah.
It's almost like my ideas aren't holding up in scrutiny. Joining us now, and I should tell everybody, by the way, just while we're live, and we'll be back on format after the interview, but you can definitely hit us up with a super chat donation, and as with everything else, that's great when you do it. Just click super chat, and that's great. What am I in Rubin mode? Exactly. Joining us now is Crew on TMBS. We do a lot of illicit histories together on the history of the military-industrial complex, the bureaucracy and ideology. And he is the Pyle Professor of American Foreign Policy at the University of Washington. Of course, I'm talking about our friend Daniel Bessner. Danny, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So I want to talk first about Samantha Power. Who is she, and why is she a problem?
Well, it's a leading question. So Samantha Power is someone who first came to public attention in the early 2000s. She wrote a book released in 2002 called A Problem from Hell. I believe the subtitle is America in the Age of Genocide. And the book essentially argued that the United States made a series of foreign policy failures over the course of the 20th century, beginning with the Armenian genocide and continuing through Saddam Hussein's gassing of Kurds in the late 1980s. Specifically, she said that U.S. policymakers made a mistake by not responding forcefully to genocide. And this was her big claim. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2003. And she essentially argued that going forward, the United States needed to do a lot more to combat genocide. What I think it's important to emphasize is that Power has been caricatured as arguing in favor solely of military intervention. But in actuality, she essentially had a series of graduated steps that U.S. policymakers should take to respond to genocide. And she expressed this in her book, A Problem from Hell, which won the Pulitzer. And what it essentially does, what this book essentially does, is that it crystallizes the 1990s era thinking about what the United States should do with its overwhelming military power in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. And listeners might know about genocides in Rwanda, genocides in the Balkans, and culminating with Kosovo. And the United States didn't intervene in Rwanda, but did eventually intervene in Bosnia. And this was basically the major foreign policy discussion amongst liberals after the Cold War, is how does the United States make the world a better place with its awesome power, political power, economic power, and of course, military power. And she writes this book. She becomes very famous. She begins working for Barack Obama. She leaves after working for Obama for a year, but Obama hires her as a foreign policy advisor on his campaign. And when he wins office in 2008, he names Power to two positions on the National Security Council. She serves on these positions during his first term, and then in his second term, she's the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And just, I'll wrap up here, but very briefly, she was very much in favor of intervening in Libya to stop a massacre at Benghazi, or at what she perceived to be a massacre at Benghazi, and was also in favor of intervening militarily in Syria to combat Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons. And that's Samantha Power in a nutshell.
So one track of criticizing her, and I think, did we already show this photo, guys, that we have up? One track of criticizing her. This is a photo of her during the Obama administration, taken with Henry Kissinger at a Yankees game. Yeah. And of course, even in her own book, which I actually read back in college myself, you know, if you write a modern history of the U.S. basic lack of response or complicity in genocide, obviously Henry Kissinger is going to come up. And if you have any kind of basic awareness of humanity, you would consider him a war criminal who's responsible for atrocities across the globe, obviously most famously in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, but, you know, Chile, Cyprus, you know, and so on. This is you know, and so one part of it is, okay, here's just the sort of trajectory of how somebody becomes a foreign policy Mandarin, and maybe in the time that someone like Samantha Power is rising, you know, the discourse of so-called kind of like muscular liberalism or humanitarian intervention. There was all these sort of horrific terminology that was popular late in the Clinton administration, and then actually through you know, people in the Democratic Party and in the liberal intelligentsia who embraced the invasion of Iraq, people who put Tony Blair, who we did in the cold open, on a huge pedestal, that, you know, and so that it's all just sort of empty and bullshit, right? Like, how can somebody kind of discourse these types of concerns and then buddy with Kissinger? And you know, that's fine, and you could tee off on that, and there's certainly truth in it. But I think what you're talking about is that there's actually a real, just as there was obviously fundamental problems in Kissinger's worldview, there's fundamental problems in the humanitarian intervention worldview, even if we took it at face value.
Right, and I think that's a good tee off, and I think it's important to say that in her book, Power actually basically criticizes Kissinger for being a war criminal. So I think this is sort of the ironies of the paths that one takes to get into actual power, and we could talk about that later. But what I think it's important to emphasize is that why Power is so interesting as a person is she basically embodies 2 decades of liberal thought about what to do when the United States no longer faces an existential enemy. So throughout the Cold War, there's this very clear logic: the United States needs to defeat communism, and that this is a political struggle, and the U.S. military is acting in a political way, and it's very much a part of this political ideology. But what happens after the collapse of the Soviet Union is you essentially have a generation of liberal thinkers, really a generation of Generation Xers, actually, people who are around 20, 25 when the Soviet Union collapses, the people who will literally staff the Obama administration later on. You have a generation of people who begin arguing that the American military, because it no longer faces a political ideology, and that there is the quote-unquote the end of history, and that everyone has agreed that liberal democratic capitalism, you know, defined in a very ideological way, but that was not the language of the time. But the idea was that because everyone agreed on this particular political form, one was able to actually use the U.S. military for humanity and not for politics. And so this is an enormous shift in American thinking about the military, where the military is no longer thought of as a particularly political arm of the U.S. state, but as actually an arm of humanity itself. That you could recognize what's going wrong in the world, and that you'll be able to use the military to stop it. And it's not a surprise, and this is what I think is really interesting, is that after the Cold War, really for the first time in American history, you have an explosion of public discussion about the Holocaust. So there's a little bit of discussion in the 60s and the 70s around the Eichmann trial in particular, and there's a famous basically soap opera about the Holocaust. But really, even if you Google engram something and you Google just the Holocaust, public discussions of the Holocaust really take off after the end of the Cold War, because essentially the Holocaust, I think at least, becomes the justification for American empire when the empire no longer faces a political or an existential threat. Because the Holocaust is I would say, wrongly remembered as the U.S. going abroad in order to save Europe's Jews. Now, of course, this ignores the fact that, for example, it was the Red Army that actually liberated Auschwitz and actually liberated the death camps in the East. But there's this idea that becomes very popular amongst liberal thinkers in the 1990s, and this idea is really underlined after the failure of the Clinton administration to intervene in the Rwandan genocide. And this is an enormous issue because right after the Rwandan genocide, there's a genocide in the Balkans against basically Bosnian Muslims. And so Clinton eventually intervenes in this genocide. He ends the siege of Sarajevo. And so you have these foundational paradigmatic experience to a generation of Generation Xers, literally, who see the American military basically, quote unquote, saving babies and saving innocents. And this is what really shapes public discussion for the next 20 years of thinking about the American military. So in the run-up to the invasion in Iraq, there's a lot of different arguments going around about why the United States needs to invade Iraq. But one of the most powerful was that there's a casus belli, there's a just war because Saddam has committed genocide against the Kurds, and that you could legitimately overthrow him because this is in the name of humanitarianism. So you have this conflation of the idea that the United States is able to act for humanity. And I'll end there, but I just want to underline one thing. I think it's also, the ironies of history is that actually a lot of the post-Soviet world was actually inviting the United States to do just this. Right. So this is where it gets complicated because you actually have people on the ground in the former Soviet, less so maybe in Central Asia, but in the former, behind the Iron Curtain, saying, United States, come in, make Europe safe again. So there's this problem because in some sense these people are listening to quote unquote people on the ground, even though they're basically maintaining the imperial military that was constructed during the Cold War. So the problem is that one of the many problems of humanitarian intervention is that to do it well, you need to have an essentially permanently mobilized military and a permanently mobilized society. And this is something people like Samantha Power never once considered.
Right. And so just to add to that, that's really interesting because on one hand, we know as an example when it came to Iraq, which was obviously a significant dividing line in this. And I'm, these are very different figures, but I'm not a tanky. So I have appreciation for people in the, particularly independent trade unions in the 80s resisting oppression in the Soviet Union. And I actually think one of the most interesting things that Samuel Moyn documents in his book is that a lot of those people, some of them were reactionaries, some of them were neoliberals, but some of them were actually quite adamant the whole time that they were socialists, and they praised the Soviet system for achieving a degree of material security, and they just wanted to add political openness on top of that, which I think is actually, basically some version of that synthesis is what I think a lot of is our project. That's what we're struggling for. But anyways, that being as it may, Václav Havel, who, I think is part of his, maybe some of the naivete that grew out of his struggle against, the Soviet system in the Czech Republic, which led him to sort of become a big fan of Clinton and Blair and a sort of endless romanticizer of America. He has this incredible mark against him because he went along with the invasion of Iraq. And then Nelson Mandela, who, we've talked a lot about on the show, certainly he and the ANC made peace with global capitalism, probably had no choice in liberation of apartheid, but he was unflinching in understanding what the war in Iraq was really all about in terms of imperial objectives. And that sort of split is really important. Do you think?
Well, and
please go ahead.
Just to very briefly, I think that's very important to emphasize because what winds up happening, unsurprisingly, perhaps I would say unsurprisingly, is that humanitarian intervention winds up occurring almost entirely in the global South. Or discussions about humanitarian intervention are almost entirely in the global South. And the International Criminal Court and all of these post-Cold War institutions that were created to quote-unquote manage the globe in a humanitarian way are basically ways to discipline the global South, which is why I think last time I checked, everyone who's ever been convicted by the ICC is from sub-Saharan Africa. Right, so I think it's not surprising.
I think
that
maybe
Mandela
one from
would
the
be more aware.
Balkans. Maybe one from the Balkans.
Well, there's Milosevic. there's Milosevic, but they had to create a separate court so the
Right.
United States could actually participate in that because the U.S. doesn't belong to the ICC.
Right.
So there's also like these random courts created. But yeah, so it's most or maybe one or two, but it's clearly that. So then you get these divisions, right, between this quote unquote second world and what was then called the third world during the Cold War and the global South. So that's why someone like Havel would be in favor of Iraq, where someone like Mandela would not be, right? Their positions, their subjectivities are very different and really part of these very radically different histories. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's thank you. So, and then that actually, we're going to pivot in a second to Obama specifically, but I just want to say, so, and even when we look going back into something like Kosovo and the Balkans, which I want to re-educate myself on, but or something where there was a lot of discourse like on Darfur, it's not that, I don't buy a narrative that, oh no, Milosevic was just some misunderstood guy who was trying to, have national cohesion. Like, there's no doubt that he was a butcher and he was a murderer.
Absolutely.
And he was playing, in fact, a lot of the kind of, I would say a lot of the politics that he favored are very trendy right now globally. But that the larger picture, though, is that also that even very much so in the Balkans, as well as all of these other places, that this conflate. I mean, first of all, obviously, during this whole time, you're ignoring and still supporting all sorts of governments and regimes that engage in equal atrocities. But if they're part of the Western system, they're not going to get bothered.
Right.
In fact, they'll get propped. So we're still, at the same time that Tony Blair is doing these highfalutin speeches about Kosovo, he's making sure that you can sell arms, arms to Suharto's Indonesia. And then so that this, and the step I don't want to make here is to deny that these atrocities aren't taking place, which I think some people go to, which is a problem and unnecessary, whether we're talking about Syria or Kosovo. But at the same time, there's no doubt that what's really going on here is that there's a perceived threat to a NATO or Western security order. And that is real, like, there's no military action that is purely going to take place, even from misguided humanitarian intentions, because that's simply not how it works.
Yeah, and I think what you're really highlighting is that I think in the 1990s and people who still sort of swim in this discourse, their fundamental problem is that they pose humanitarian intervention as a philosophical problem. Do we save innocent babies? Right. When that's actually not the question of humanitarian intervention. The question of humanitarian intervention is contextual, right? Those are the important questions. Do we know enough about what's going on the ground? How do we know that what we do isn't going to make things work like what happened, make things worse like what happened in Libya? Who are we actually interacting with? Is the United States going to commit itself to reconstruction efforts? And all of these different problems, right? So Power, in her books and in her writing, she always poses it as, do we save innocent babies? Like someone has a gun to a baby's head and right. We're there, and do we stop it? And yeah, of course, the answer to that is of course you save the innocent baby. But that's not actually the important questions of geopolitics. So they make a fundamental category error, which prevents them from providing good policy advice. And this is why you have someone like Power very much supporting intervention in Libya and very much supporting intervention in Syria, because she makes a fundamental category error. It's not really a moral question. It's a question of history, it's a question of process, and it's a question of context.
And in both of those conversations, like, we just have this new report from Air Wars, saying that U.S. just airstrikes related to ISIS, regardless of even the broader questions of the proxy war with Assad, have killed at least 7,000 people in the last year. I mean, cumulatively, probably going back to 2014. I mean, it's tens of thousands of people. So that's the other part of the ledger, and the kind of stunning arrogance and naivete of this position is that you can, one, go into not ask the right basic framing questions and have this incredible imperial arrogance and sense of self-righteousness, but even the most basic question of, and this applied obviously to Kosovo and Serbia too. Okay, well, you're going to bomb Belgrade. Well, what are you doing when you bomb these places?
Right. What's the day after? Right. And this is the problem. They always talk about the moment of decision. It's actually, ironically, a very sort of right-wing way of viewing things, where the whole of politics boils down to making a decision. And this is, in fact, I just want to emphasize for listeners, this is actually an element of American political culture where we understand the height of politics to be the moment of decision. So, for example, George W. Bush names his memoir Decision Points, and Hillary Clinton names her memoir Hard Choices. Right. So this is how we understand politics, about these moments of decision, when it's actually not really about that. It's about the incredibly large context, the multiple contexts, the multiple complexities that go into making a particular event. And so this is a real problem with policymaking generally in the United States.
So then we have this thing, and this history still matters because this is probably still in many ways the default position of people who are trained in the bureaucracy of foreign policy around most people in the Democratic Party. I mean, this is an example of how you could see today, even under Trump, you will actually see people, in one breath rightfully saying that Donald Trump is this hideous monster and he's a racist and all the rest, which he absolutely is across the board, but then actually saying like, oh, but we might need to team up with him to support a coup in Venezuela, right? Like, so this is still alive today. And one of the things that kept it alive, obviously, and this is where we need to, keep fleshing out the Obama legacy, is, and this is very bizarre because this is a really well-known speech, which is kind of hard to find in video, which is surprising. But this is Senator Obama, State Senator Obama. This is in 2002 at an anti-Iraq war rally in Chicago. There's no question that the fact that Barack Obama got the invasion of Iraq right is what, that's why he beat Hillary Clinton. But in this speech, and this is fascinating because this is in 2002, he's a state senator representing a liberal district. And, on one hand, I guess we could, credit his incredible strategic acumen. But he is doing a frame here in opposing the invasion of Iraq, which sets up, in fact, the whole Obama administration for catastrophic, not only Libya and Syria potentially, but catastrophically escalating Afghanistan that I'd like you to talk about. Let's play this brief clip, and then I'll throw to you.
I don't oppose war in all circumstances, and when I look out over this crowd today, I know there is no shortage of patriots or patriotism. What I do oppose is a dumb war.
And it goes on to say, that's literally all that's there, but he goes on to say, what I do oppose is a rash war, and he makes a whole show of, there's supposedly smart wars and dumb wars.
It will almost...
How does that fit with what Obama did? And I guess even just that basic idea in liberal discourse is a distinction emanating out of the Bush administration between the savagery of the attack in Afghanistan versus the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, so I think what you see there, and the basic distinction between quote-unquote dumb and smart wars, which was very big amongst Democratic discourse in the 2000s, and even is still there a bit today, is the assumption that the United States is going to have wars. That the United States, in the absence of the Soviet Union, is still going to have these wars in the world. So the question is, what is a good war and what is a bad war? And so the basic distinction and where this really got big was, as you were saying, between Afghanistan and Iraq. And the idea that Obama is expressing is that Afghanistan is a smart war because they gave harbor to terrorists, these I have to say quote unquote terrorists. I hate the term, but I'm just using it for common sense. But they gave harbor to terrorists. They attacked the United States, and there we have a just cause to attack Afghanistan. But Iraq is a dumb war because there's no just cause. So what this suggests is that it goes back to this just war theory, and particularly a thinker named Michael Walzer, who was very popular in the 1990s, who essentially created the intellectual edifice for humanitarian intervention and what became the quote-unquote responsibility to protect, this idea adopted by the UN that internal populations were able to call on external forces in order to overthrow illegitimate government sources. So it's this basic idea between if you have a just cause for a war, then you can go, and if you don't, you can't. And again, this goes back to the fact that these aren't asked as contextual or historical questions. They're just framed as moral questions. So you essentially have the absence of the Soviet Union creates the intellectual space for American foreign policymakers to ignore very basic ideas of geopolitics in order to frame international relations as a passion play between the quote-unquote capital G good and the quote-unquote capital B bad. And this is expressed in this bifurcation between a smart war and a dumb war and a good war and a bad war. Now, what this ignores is that all war, or war of necessity, another way it's framed, is a war of necessity and a war of choice. And that actually became the most dominant framing in the foreign policy establishment. But what this ignores is that all wars are wars of necessity. Every single war that the United States has basically engaged in has been a war of choice, except maybe the War of 1812, when the British literally invaded what was part of sovereign territory of the United States. So it really obscures the fact and lays the ground for not only a militaristic foreign policy, which we've talked about enough, but also not enough, but we've talked about a lot. You always talk about it more, but basically a militaristic public culture. Right. So if people like you and I who grew up in the 90s will remember that the culture wasn't quite as militarized as it was after 9/11, right? With all of these troops everywhere, with the planes flying over football stadiums, et cetera, et cetera. So you have these deeply pernicious effects by just assuming that the United States needs to always maintain the material capacity to go to war abroad. And this is what these divisions between good and bad, between necessary and unnecessary, totally allied. The fact that there's this hyper-militarized empire that has the capacity to do whatever it wants in the world.
Yeah, and and even obviously extensive propaganda outreach by the Pentagon and the CIA and in Hollywood. Video games. The idea that those institutions are almost always reflected positively in modern pop culture versus even being like, maybe the hidden villains or something like that, what they more accurately are in older pieces of pop culture. So
yeah, and I think it's important just to briefly emphasize it's not as mistaken in the 1990s. You get a bunch of movies about World War II and a bunch of movies about the Holocaust, right? Because this is essentially the baby boom generation providing the justification for continued American empire after the Soviet collapse. So I think it's important to emphasize that it just doesn't start after 9/11, but there's basically a 10-year getting ready for what happens after 9/11 in the 1990s, basically providing the intellectual resources available, making them available for the notion that the United States is able to do whatever the hell it wants in the world.
So if we look at it, and we'll get to today in a minute or two, but if we were going to think of like 2 or 3 phases, it would be like there's the Clinton 90s, there's the search for, of course, the Cold War is over. Obviously, we're not going to just like massively draw down the military and cut defense spending and create national health care and take on the burgeoning ecological crisis, God forbid. So we need this new, and even just the kind of like weird psychological positionality. I think honestly, it sounds ridiculous, but I do think there's also the element of a lot of baby boomers who got out of Vietnam and then they felt somehow emasculated and they were looking for some, their expression of some type of like toxic. I will in this case actually I will never use it again on the show because I hate this kind of woke discourse, but actually really like toxic masculinity, this like idea that like virility will be found through, military adventurism, through some kind of broader purpose. So, but then there's also a lot of stuff in the 90s is also though about, it's that these things are terrible, but they're these little side excursions. And really what's happening is that it's all about making the world open for markets. And of course we actually know that that's actually its own, highly restrictive and predatory system. It's, writing the rules of global capital in a way that favors, multinational corporations at the expense of human beings and the planet and labor and so on. We know that story. That's the kind of core of the WTO and Clinton era foreign policy. Then in the Bush era, there's this weird dual track where on one hand, the part that, the Walzers and the Blairs of the world are actually emphasizing, and George W. Bush too had a lot of democracy promotion, talk, was that we're going to be the bomber wing of everything that needs to happen, of women's rights in Afghanistan, of oppressed religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq. And then, of course, on the other hand, both in terms of what's actually happening, which is just this, okay, we have one, the AUMF, one military authority, which still exists today, and we're going to go just lay waste across the globe. By the time I think it would be fair to say, right, by like 2005 at least, the response to 9/11 had already claimed 1 million lives at least, between Afghanistan and Iraq, and the torture regime. So we have that dual track in Bush. And I just want to spell this all out because I want you to place all of it for us. And then under Obama, it's the sort of synthesis of Clinton and Bush with this emphasis on smartness, basically. And I think that cuts through drones as well.
Right. So when Obama gets into office, he basically says that what went wrong with the Bush administration is that you essentially have a total elite foreign policy making. And his entire idea was that you're going to be able to have discussions. And if you bring the smartest people into the room and they have a free discussion, the best policies will arrive. The problem with that is that it doesn't actually address any of the fundamental assumptions that led the United States to intervene in Iraq, to have this hyper-militarized post-Cold War foreign policy. So Obama basically just accepts the indispensable nation rhetoric that which he grew up with as a Generation Xer in the 80s and 90s, right? Obama is very much a product of this post-Cold War moment and the idea that the military is able to act in favor of humanity. So Obama doesn't question that. He just questions essentially the process around which one decides to use military force. So, unsurprisingly, as everyone argued, he adopts a very neoliberal technocratic approach to the use of military force, one organized literally around process and getting people in the room. Now, eventually, he becomes disappointed with that because the military essentially hates Obama and they start doing all of these leaks, et cetera, and he eventually winds up in his second term concentrating foreign policy authority around his person in particular, which is why he doesn't intervene, he does militarize Syria and does a lot of stuff there, but he doesn't, bomb Syria in the same way that he used airstrikes in Libya. And just one thing that I want to emphasize, I think the crucial way to understand the links between liberal internationalism and sort of the Christian neoconservatism that George W. Bush promoted was this really, I'm a historian, this thing that's really embedded in American political culture, which is this millenarianism, that the United States has the right and duty to basically remake the world in its image. And it's there in the 1630 sermon where they coined the term City on a Hill. It's there in Woodrow Wilson, the liberal internationalism, which is really what Samantha Power and Barack Obama are heirs to. And it's there in the neoconservatism, particularly the Christian neoconservatism of someone like George W. Bush. So even though they had different approaches, there's a lot of fundamental cultural assumptions about the United States' role in the world that really unite a bunch of different Republican and Democratic administrations. Now, what's different about Trump, and just very briefly, is that Trump, I think, approaches foreign policy in a very transactional way. So Trump has no illusions about the United States being this millenarian power who's going to remake the world in a good way. And I think that's what was appealing about his message to not only his base, but to many critics of American foreign policy, is that Trump is very much not an American exceptionalist. He thinks America is just a nation like any other nation, and like any other nation, it should try to do whatever, it should try to fuck over the world for its own interests. So it's a very transactional approach.
I mean, that was the thing, right? Like, we've talked about this example of when he said to Bill O'Reilly, "Oh, what, you think we're so innocent?" And it's one hand, it's like, that's amazing to finally watch, an American politician acknowledge that obviously we don't act from a moral standpoint in our foreign policy. But then conversely, it's like, when Noam Chomsky says it, he means like we shouldn't be like that. Not like,
yeah. It sounds like we should just stop pretending we're better and should just do it, but better.
Right, exactly.
It's a totally different moral universe.
Totally different moral universe. So, and that loops back to the opening commentary, right? Like, because, I was talking about this. Everybody should be concerned by this Mike Pompeo commission on inalienable rights, obviously. I mean, I think the prime focus of that one is obviously very specifically a targeting of the LGBTQ community and a targeting of women specifically with regards to abortion. Obviously, these are people, just even alone in terms of their active and aggressive support of the genocide in Yemen, and I absolutely use that word, very consciously now. I think it really is a genocidal campaign that we've supported every step of the way.
Absolutely.
So, this is like this is the thing, and I think this is the argument of the time in every area, domestic and foreign. I do think that even if we limp along with just a sort of generic Democrat that defeats Trump, I still think that this system is done. We're not getting back there. I mean, you could see it in the micro examples of Macron and Trudeau, right? We're not returning to this. There is this horrible right-wing authoritarian ascendancy. So what is a post-empire foreign policy? Like, what does it actually look like to deal with this? Yeah.
So what I would say is that a post-empire foreign policy would be the longest term way of thinking about it. I think if we're talking about today and tomorrow, and should a President Bernie or whoever wins Kamala Harris, I think we're going to be in a transitional moment, at least for the next presidential administration. So we have to think, how are we going to create the conditions to even get to a post-empire foreign policy? Just like Rome wasn't built in a day, it also wasn't destroyed in a day, right? It's a long, long process through which these imperial structures are actually dismantled. So I think what we should be doing now, or let's say whoever Bernie's foreign policy advisors are, or whatever the new Quincy Institute, the anti-militarist think tank, does, I think they really need to start thinking about the type of new institutional architecture that is going to, one, dismantle empire, and two, prevent the United States from doing it again in the future by creating at least some sort of legislative capacity to rein in the imperial presidency. And as it suggests, I think the first thing we need to do is totally reform the office of the presidency. I don't think people fully appreciate how concentrated foreign policy authority is in the White House. And so the only way we're going to get in post-imperial foreign policy is if we get first a post-imperial presidency, by literally restricting what the executive is able to do. And this doesn't just relate to foreign policy in terms of abroad, but it also relates to associated areas like immigration, right? There's a lot of discussion, particularly amongst the left, of all the domestic things that a President Bernie would do. But ironically, Bernie is going to have most of his authority, barring executive orders, which he could basically do whatever he wants. But if he doesn't want to do executive orders and put things on a firmer basis, his major authority is actually in foreign policy making. So what Bernie could do is actually personally restrict the capacities of the office of the presidency to do everything that it is able to do. And I think once we start doing that, then we could start thinking about, just for example, closing some of the 800 bases, getting rid of some of those aircraft carriers, getting very low on nuclear weapons, engaging in mutual disarmament treaties, stop fucking arming the world with American weapons, things like that. So I think that is the first stage, this transitional period is the focus of immediate concern. And then once we do that, we'll be able to think about, so the United States is still an incredibly powerful nation. What can we do in post-imperial foreign policy? And for me, that is creating a union. The first step is creating a union of North America between Mexico, Canada, and the United States that isn't defined by the hierarchies that traditionally separate the global North from the global South. That could be a first true post-imperial foreign policy, and also, as it suggests, post-national foreign policy, because we need to start thinking beyond the confines of the nation state if we want to start truly thinking beyond the confines of empire.
And could a focus point of that, at some point that this needs to be leveraged into, really obviously dealing with the ecological crisis. It has to be something, it has to be, right?
Right. Some global
disarmament and ecology.
Yeah. So the question is, how do you create an international infrastructure that is, one, democratic? Because what we've seen is that these anti-democratic structures like the EU only last so long before there's some sort of public rebellion. But two, how do you create it in a meaningful way where you're able to come to the table with China and India and Russia, where they're very concerned about development? The left hasn't talked about development in the United States because it's not really been an issue for Americans for a long time. But these countries, India and China in particular, are very concerned about industrial development and post-industrial development. So how do you make concessions, redistribute resources in such a way where these countries are able to, quote unquote, develop in the way that they want without totally destroying the environment? And the only way you're going to do that is by voluntarily giving up American hegemony. So, for example, the United States needs to get the hell out of East Asia. right? This ring of bases that surrounds China, from South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, etc. We need to get out of there if we're ever going to be able to deal with China in a way that's going to be able to manage the global good of the climate or the global inequality problem, right? So we need to do these things almost immediately. And it's a very tall order because we still have these material structures that define the world.
My last question on the much shorter time frame. I mean, Barbara Lee is having some success, and I want to always say, I mean, really seriously, Barbara Lee is the only single member of Congress that voted against the authorization, the AUMF, in the days after 9/11. Which, I mean, and obviously now we're echoing it when we talk about, the president, targeting the 4 congresswomen, and the fact that obviously the Democratic leadership, of course, in their usual, just sort of pathetic, utter lack of moral cowardice, doesn't have their back. Barbara Lee was alone in this extraordinary vote, and she has been working steadily to try to repeal the AUMF. What's the importance of that specific technical step as well?
So the basic importance of that is that it provides some sort of restriction on the president, where the president isn't basically just allowed to do whatever she or he wants. And that's an important first step, but that is just a baby step in the right direction, right? Mm-hmm. We need to totally rethink the vested authority and the very office of the executive. The problem is that liberals, and I'm not going to say leftists here, but I'm specifically referring to liberals, they have this delusion that as long as their guy is in there, then everything is going to be okay. And we need to work against that. It doesn't matter who's in there, even if it's Bernie. The office needs to be grossly restricted from what it is now. Otherwise, we're never going to have a post-imperial foreign policy. But too much authority in an elected king is never going to result in a post-empire.
Daniel Bessner, as always, I appreciate your time immensely. Everybody, you can find all the ways to follow Daniel's indispensable work. He's writing all over the place. His book on the history of the defense intellectual establishment was amazing. Our 2-part history for patrons on the history of the Rand Corporation was amazing. Daniel Bessner, thanks so much, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Take care. All right, folks. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a little pitch, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the 4 congresswomen, and then we're going to go into the post game. But I'll just start by saying, we'll leave it brief today, but become a patron. Patreon.com/TMBS. Now, as you follow our various social media accounts, what is our account on Instagram now, David?
Brooks Show.
Michael Brooks Show, at Michael Brooks Show on Instagram. There's photos, there's a lot of stuff going on from the show, and now also on our Twitter, as well as Instagram. Our Twitter is at TMBSFM, and I pretty much always retweet it at _Michael Brooks, and of course at Matt Leck and at David Griscom. Are going to be, in addition to great snippets of all of our YouTube videos, and obviously if you haven't yet, of course, subscribe to YouTube, there's going to be teasers that we put out of our Sunday illicit histories and idea primers, which, as an example, I just said, the 2-part history on the history of the Rand Corporation with Daniel Bessner, 2-part history of Silicon Valley fascism with the great Corey Pine, as one of many, many examples. 21 and above patrons get regular Skype calls with me, as well as video illicit histories. Right now, Patrice Lumumba on the Congo. Next week, the history going back to the 1960s, the context that led up to this slow motion coup and political imprisonment of Lula that we've covered so closely on this show. That's with Vic Viana. Then, of course, there's post games. We really appreciate it. Certainly by the end of the year, conservatively, and I'd like to do it well before, but conservatively by the end of the year, we got to hit 3,000 patrons. That's super conservative. We should be well above that by the end of the year, frankly. And also 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. So now is the time, if you haven't done it yet, join us at patreon.com/TMBS. There's also a massive community on the Discord. There's a huge amount of things going on. You get far more content and engagement as a patron. I'll just say this because it's getting close now. Shipped in the mail is our first piece of TMBS gear, and you're going to start to be able to actually see us wearing some of this, and then you're going to be able to buy it, and it's dope. Then you're also going to want to come see us in Chicago, August 24th. Left is Best Midwest Fest. I'm excited about this. Gene Bajalan's going to be with us. He's one of our other amazing contributors. History of a professor at Missouri State University. We've talked about the history of the Kurdish struggle, Iranian relations, U.S. coups in Iran, as well as the supposed anti-Semitism controversy in the British Labour Party. These are all illicit histories. He's going to be there. And then Chuck Mertz. I'm really excited about this. I love This Is Hell. This Is Hell, I mean, it started as a leftist radio show in the 1990s. It's still a radio show and it's a podcast. This guy has interviewed everybody. He also does a lot with our buddy Brian Mayer from the indispensable Brazil Wire. Chuck's going to be there with us. Do not miss this show. We packed Brooklyn and LA. Those were incredibly fun shows. Maybe Chicago will be a little less rowdy.
Probably shouldn't be any more rowdy than LA was.
No, LA was very motley crew. But we appreciate everybody. We can't wait to see you at the live show. And it's time. Become a patron, patreon.com/TMBS. So let's just talk a little bit about this. It's no news to anybody who has any cognitive or emotional capacity that Donald Trump is a racist. He's a buffoon. He's grotesque. He's disgusting. The man has concentration camps. And I think it's actually very important in this context to remind people that the context and the ability to do that policy was implemented by both the creation of ICE under a Homeland Security package signed by George W. Bush and some very aggressive deportation policies in the Obama-Biden administration. Now, as I've always said, though, this is not just a difference of degree, it's a difference of kind. And Donald Trump is characterized by strategic white supremacy. And the Republican Party is characterized by strategic white supremacy in the sense that for some people, this is a genuine, disgusting conviction. For other people, it's just the fact that they see the writing on the wall and that a fusion of oligarchy and white identity politics is the Republican Party. And that's why a combination of voter suppression and terrorizing immigrants is the electoral path they see. And I'm not drawing a false equivalency. There is absolutely no false equivalency. The worst Democrat you can name does not represent white supremacy and the level of severity of threat that Donald Trump does. That's objectively true. What's also objectively true is that the Democratic leadership is just so utterly free of morals, courage, strategic capacity, political instincts, political toughness, and almost all of their leadership are preoccupied by the most narrow pedestrian concerns. It's increasingly clear that people like Nancy Pelosi and Hakeem Jeffries are more interested in controlling a caucus than the country. They're not going to go to the mat for children in concentration camps, and they're certainly not going to go to the mat for the four prime leaders actually showing leadership in Congress today. This should be a surprise to no one. I mean, look, we were talking a couple of months ago when Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer went to AIPAC, and forget your position on Israel-Palestine. Whether you support a 67 two-state solution, whether you support a binational democracy, AIPAC is a racist, far-right, xenophobic, nationalistic, extremist organization. They went there and they co-signed on slanders and smears and lies about Ilhan Omar that could, let's be blunt, jeopardize her life. That's who Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are. Is it any mystery that in the same week that Nancy Pelosi is having, I'm guessing cocktails with the not relevant since she said Al Gore shouldn't, Al Gore was weird because he wore earth tones or whatever the fuck Maureen Dowd is. Maureen Dowd is talking with Nancy Pelosi and Rahm Emanuel, recycling, in Rahm Emanuel's case, maybe the most despicable person in Democratic politics. The laundering moral cowardice and no strategic vision. That's the last thing I want to say here about these Democratic leaders. It's not just, I mean, it would be one thing if their utter amorality had a political upside. All they are doing is pissing off and alienating a emerging base, and they're doing something that's more ephemeral but actually matters, which is they are looking like confused cowards to normal people. And that doesn't sell well. This actually sells well from Ilhan Omar because she's speaking clearly.
With those who protest against them in Charlottesville. This is a president who has openly violated the very value our country aspires to uphold: equality under the law, religious liberty, equal protection, and protection from persecution. And to distract from that, he's launching a blatantly racist attack on 4 duly elected members of the United States House of Representatives, all of whom are women of color. This is the agenda of white nationalists. Whether it is happening in chat rooms or it's happening on national TV, and now it's reached the White House garden. He would love nothing more than to divide our country based on race, religion, gender, orientation, or immigration status. Because this is the only way he knows he can prevent the solidarity of us working together across all of our differences. The only way to prevent us confronting the problems our country is facing, whether it is healthcare, climate change, student debt, or our endless wars. This is his plan to pit us against one another. This is how he can continue to enrich his friends and distract us from the detrimental policies that his administration is pushing forth.
That's leadership. That's clarity. And if you have 3 different positions right now, which is Donald Trump is doing his thing. He's doing race war politics. He doesn't even have the ability to lie and bullshit and fake economic populism. He's been a pure 1% Republican. This is all he's got. So then you have a clear response and clear leadership. And by the way, I can't help but be reminded of that asshole Tucker Carlson who does fake populism too. That is precisely the same sentiment that the Somali labor organizer is talking about in the Amazon strike. She is calling upon the best ideals of this country and saying precisely that you need to work in common efforts across lines to take on oligarchy, inequity, ecological crisis, get people health care, and cancel student loan debts. And yes, that's exactly right. The byproduct of all of this bloated bigotry and entitlement is redistribution of wealth to wealthy people. That's it. And then Schumer and Pelosi want to sit there and hold the ball and run out the clock. The problem is that you can't, this isn't a basketball game to do the sports analogy. When you're holding a ball where on the other side of that ball, that game is people, not just children. Let's say people. Rashida Tlaib actually really eloquently underlined that. People in concentration camps. A deal to send a chunk of those people to Guatemala, which is run by a far-right government backed by the United States that is mired in corruption and abuses, so it can be another outsource for more of our problems that we create. So that's the leadership. And that is a perfect distillation of the 3 choices we have here. And I will say again, the only other thing we'll do is we got to play this CNN clip because that's just disgusting. But this is another area. I didn't even say it with Bessner, but on foreign policy, yes, the power that a president has over foreign policy, this is another reason why you absolutely need to vote for Bernie Sanders. And today, Bernie Sanders, just as he has used his email list to warn people about ICE raids, to help support strikers, to help support people providing vital health services for women in states where medieval abortion assault laws are being passed. He put out a tweet and an email today saying, do a 4-way split donation to Ayanna Pressley, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib. None of these people have even endorsed him, by the way. Just to be really clear about that. A couple of months ago, he had by far the most unequivocal and clear statement about Ilhan Omar. Period. When the rubber meets the road, whether it is voting against defense budgets, whether it is voting against military industrial complex budgets, whether it is highlighting the work of grassroots activists. That's why he has anti-gentrification activists with him on stage in Chicago. Whether it is coming out and not just putting out a tweet or doing the thing that they all do. I mean, everybody's got the Donald Trump is an asshole tweet. Nancy Pelosi's tweets are an art form. Donald Trump is a massive bigoted asshole, and we should work together on roads. Donald Trump knows how to roll these people. Bernie Sanders is showing up. And I'm sorry, that is more important than wonkery. That's movement building. That's leadership. That's something to somebody's core. It's not that he's the best. He's of a different kind. And I won't even go into it, but apparently there's some fucking morons complaining that he did this. That just shows that we're at a state of nonsense here that, we're going to have to narrow who we can even answer on this show, because some people are just, off in whatever ridiculous, rabbit hole. The hatred of him is bizarre. But the leadership and the record is clear. We need to play this because this is the corollary. This is the press version of the Democratic leadership. Now we're going to say, if you're Donald Trump and you're part of these white, bigot brigades, that Ilhan Omar sympathizes with Al-Qaeda. Now, it will go without saying that not only does she not sympathize with Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda would murder her, if we're being real about this. Now, that is a smear. It's a lie. It's fundamentally dishonest. It's bigoted. It's grotesque. And the only way of asking her about this is, are you disturbed that the rhetoric is escalating like this? Are you concerned about this new level of fear-mongering and dishonesty? But this reporter, and I thought it was a CNN reporter, but is this a Fox reporter?
Well, the clip is from Fox. I don't know who the reporter is.
I thought the reporter was from CNN. Regardless, we'll find this out later. This is a reporter at this very same press conference asking Ilhan Omar if that is true.
Of you, can you respond to some of the president's specific claims, most notably that you're a communist and that you're pro-Al-Qaeda?
You might have noticed how when he said, go back to where you came from, there was an uproar through all of our communities, because every single person who's brown and black at some point in their life in this country heard that. Now, when he made the comment, I know that every single Muslim who has lived in this country and across the world has heard that comment. And so I will not dignify it with an answer.
That's exactly right. You won't dignify it with an answer. It's disgusting. It's grotesque. And, look, we talked a lot about, on a show that we used to do, Two Dope Boys on a Podcast, my friend Phil McKenzie, and Matt produced that. We used to talk a lot about how there are no sidelines. And I think that this is a clear example of any. And, that this is a choice of literally your basics of what you support. Period. This is not obscure debate. This isn't social media controversy. This isn't even a time for tactical calculation. The president of the United States is using eliminationist rhetoric against women of color who are massively significant political leaders. And they have been consistently portrayed and undermined by their own party leadership. And that's why look, you can disagree with these particular people. I don't think there's any room for disagreement on the concentration camps. But this is absolutely outside of the realm of political debate and distinction. This is fundamentally, where are you at, who are you with, and how do you move? And the fact that by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have undermined them every step of the way has emboldened. I'm not saying that Trump wouldn't do this anyways, but you make the attack significantly more open. Now, conversely, you've created a situation where who's more important to the country right now? Ilhan Omar is more important than Nancy Pelosi right now. Ayanna Pressley is more important than Richard Neal right now. AOC is certainly more important than fucking Steny Hoyer. And Rashida Tlaib is more important than Chuck Schumer. Now, not institutionally. Institutionally, this is still the sclerotic, dysfunctional, corporate compromised hackery of the Democratic leadership. But the energy of the country is here. And if someone like Maureen Dowd thinks that this is scaling woke back mountain because you're clear that the same president who helped run the media lynch mob against the Central Park Five, and I use that word quite consciously, called for killing them, called for bringing back the death penalty for them, and has still not apologized to this day, even as they were innocent, that there is no room, so she calls it scaling woke back mountain, I believe is the last. And it's just funny to me as somebody who understands the Vampire Castle essay as an example, which people always should read by Mark Fisher. This has nothing to do with that. This is fundamentally, as Bill Fletcher Jr. would say, about whether democracy is real or not, about whether you take humanity seriously, about whether you take any type of serious anti-racist project seriously. So people like Maureen Dowd are making themselves quite clear. They don't take any of these things seriously, and they prefer to kibitz and gossip about these four who are showing more leadership and are at more personal risk than anybody else in this whole situation. Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, Hakeem Jeffries, all of that. It's disgusting. It's pathetic, and they need to be primaried. We're going to focus on the candidate running against Eliot Engel. We're going to focus more. There's a great candidate running against Steny Hoyer. I'd like to see somebody taking a look at Hakeem Jeffries. Apparently, Hakeem Jeffries is in charge of the House Democrats' Twitter account. And if you don't think that the cynical weaponization of neoliberal, quote unquote, identity politics would only be used against Bernie Sanders, don't be naive. This is a cynical political tactic of people who have no commitment to anything and nothing to sell. They will use it even as these women's lives are literally at risk. So, as always, we stand with Ilhan. Oh, I guess that's the perfect example of this. This is, what is this, Matt?
Well, this is the original House Democrats tweeted out by Michael Hardaway, who works for Hakeem Jeffries, about Sekhet Chakrabarti, who was criticizing the vote for, I think, more border funding.
And he made the point. This is a guy who works for, he's AOC's
chief of staff,
right? And this is a really important point because this is a systemic understanding. The Democratic leadership tried to get him into a rabbit hole because they talked about a congresswoman named Sharice David, I believe.
Sharice David, who's in Kansas.
Right. She's a Native American congresswoman who represents Kansas, and she's a conservative Democrat. And she voted for the border bill. Now, and precisely because this is an anti-essentialist argument, and the point is actual structure here. That's why you see these disgusting conservatives. What's their new thing? Their new big thing is, oh, look, there's Hispanic guards at the concentration camp. You don't think that that woman wasn't strategically placed there to be in the shot with Lindsey Graham and Mike Pence? And first of all, I don't know how fucking naive people are. And secondly, that's irrelevant. Yes, it's absolutely racist. And yes, absolutely people can participate in racist structures regardless of their backgrounds. That's what he said. I think the point still stands. I don't think people have to be personally racist to enable a racist system. The same could be said of the Southern Democrats. I don't believe Charisse is a racist person, but her votes are showing her to enable a racist system. Yes, she voted for the border bill without accountability. That is quite literally, that is enabling a racist system we see every day. We read the reports of the secret ICE Facebook groups. Anybody with a modicum of, anybody who's not Dave Rubin should be able to process that point. But apparently the House Democrats can't.
Yeah, it's because it's fairly clear what happened is Psychite was generally criticizing the border funding, and then someone says, well, what about Sharice Davids?
What about Sharice Davids but by the way, if you really want to get into that rabbit hole, what a cynical deployment of her.
Exactly.
Who is this guy, and why is he explicitly singling out a Native American woman of color? Her name is Congresswoman Davids, not Sharice. She is a phenomenal new member who flipped a seat blue. Keep her, then they have the hand emoji out of your mouth. Now, of course, the House Democrats are doing this a couple of days after Nancy Pelosi, among other things, said apparently to a meeting of Democrats in the House, keep it off Twitter. Now the official Twitter account will try to humiliate and get one of your members of your staff fired. But besides that, certainly don't advocate against concentration camps on Twitter. Then we have Pelosi Deputy Chief of Staff Drew Hamill on why he retweeted this obnoxious, disgusting House Democrats tweet. I retweeted this in my personal capacity as a gay man who was bullied and beaten in high school.
Not sure what that has to do with anything.
Run in. I literally have no idea what that has to do with anything, other than it's craven and cynical. And I'm assuming that. But look, I don't see a through line. I'm not going to do standpoint epistemology here. I'm going to say, and I am a straight male. I don't see a through line between being terrorized and physically assaulted because of your sexuality in high school and caping for putting children in concentration camps. I don't see that connection. Maybe you'll have to enlighten me.
I would suggest that if that's your only rationale for retweeting that, days after you yourself, we can go here, retweeted the stuff about, keeping stuff off of Twitter. See, here's the tweet where he retweets it.
Right.
Right before it, talking about that inside meeting where Pelosi said stop tweeting about their colleagues. So right afterwards, and I'd say, look, Drew, if high school is getting back to you, you should probably resign and process that a little bit more because you're fucking the party up.
Indeed, this is disgusting. I mean, it's just so. It's like you talk about these overused words like gut check time. I mean. Children in concentration camps, children dying as we speak. Then let's broaden it. I mean, let's be really wild here. How about people in concentration camps? How about refugees from our foreign policy, primarily in concentration camps? And then let's also just add, other pieces of information like readily available that, well, one, again, children have died. And also, I don't know, things like the secret Facebook group with memes of this woman you're belittling being sexually assaulted by the president, with talks, mocking the same people whose care you're supposedly in charge of, that we already know these people are dying and being tortured and being mistreated. Footage of lawyers saying, toothbrushes are extra privilege. Fuck that. Because that's administration policy. And you have time to play these pathetic fucking games with the only 4 Congress people showing serious leadership on this? I mean, a couple of other really honorable exceptions. Fucking Ed Markey, of all people, senator from Massachusetts, is there doing serious videos, talking about it, showing some actual humanity. I don't know what the fuck is wrong with these people.
This is a moment of moral clarity where you have to be able to
Yes.
look at what's going on right now, and you need to be able to stand against evil and wickedness. And the fact that there's people in the Democratic Party who are cynically like taking this moment of clarity and muddying it up with their own personal stuff is so sick and so cynical and so beyond the pale for anyone who has a conscience or a heart. I mean, this is not something that we should be equivocating on or being cowardly about. I mean, this is quite literally one of the worst human crises that's occurred within our nation in decades. And the fact that these people are being so cowardly and then trying to stand behind like anti-racism. It's like, oh, you can't criticize us because then you would be
Well, the cynical deployment
that's so
of I mean, look, that is pure standpoint epistemology, pure identity. That's wrong. That's a dead end. If it's deployed that way, that is not the same as in fact,
and it's going to be too appealing for them to not deploy it that way.
Right. Exactly. I mean, the fundamental argument of humanity, anti-racism, and anti-bigotry is these 4 congresswomen who face more sexism, more bigotry than anybody, and are the ones saying, not the fucking clap hands emoji and all this bullshit. They're saying don't let children die in concentration camps because of, incidentally, a fucking ethnic cleansing policy that's emanating from the White House, and you just voted on a clean bill for it. So save your fucking emojis and your memes and all your dumb talk and get back to why you're actually here, or not, because that actually probably is why you're here. So please just get the fuck out.
And I would also say, for anybody listening to this show, when moments like this happen, don't be one of those people saying, let's all come together, right? This is the time to really strain these tensions because they need to learn their lesson.
They need to learn their lesson. Power just needs to be reconfigured. All right, folks, we're going to go to the post game. Ton more to get to. Become a patron so you can be with us. We're going to get back to the Marianne Williamson interview. We have a great debunk. The Marianne Williamson education of Dave Rubin.
Marianne re-educates Dave.
I'm seeing Dave Rubin as sort of like a mean, sort of less fortuitous Forrest Gump. And Marianne Williamson is his teacher. We have, of course, a debunk with Ben Burgess. We have a bunch of sound to get to. Patreon.com/TMBS. Become a patron. Thanks to the whole team. Thanks to each and every one of you.